Thank you very much, Dominic, and thank you to Deakin University for the very gracious invitation to come down to this fine city and to talk about one of my favourite subjects, and clearly one of yours, is infrastructure, and in particular transport infrastructure. So thank you very much. I think these sort of sessions are really important because sometimes I am often of the opinion that there's that we need to have more debate in infrastructure. We need to sort of be able to call out what isn't going well, and also to suggest different thought paradigms as well as to how we might do it. And I think one of the sort of sobering moments was today when Marion from the Grattan Institute asked, what it was a bit like the question of, do you like country music? Do you like country or Western? And in this case, the suggestion was, well, is infrastructure the domain of government, or is it the domain of the independent entity, if you like? And I was sitting there thinking, but there's a third, and there is a third, and that is, and probably one of the areas of greatest success in infrastructure, and that is when it's customer-led infrastructure, where the owners and operators of infrastructure have a fiduciary responsibility not only to their investors but also to their customers to ensure they deliver the right services at the right time. And that's the very unfashionable term called privatisation with light-handed regulation. So let's just get it out there. And in my opinion, and I'm happy to have the debate, I think it's one of the most successful periods of modern infrastructure history in Australia. And I think we need more of it rather than less. And that is by no means to suggest that the behaviour of some of our monopolists in the privatised space have been exemplary. But by the same token, what customer-led infrastructure is really referring to is a call back to incrementalism, a call back to small is beautiful, that not all our infrastructure needs to be mega infrastructure, that not all our infrastructure needs to be bold and transformational, which is a favourite word in the infrastructure sector, but rather we can use the existing infrastructure in a way that we enhance it, we renovate it, we add technology that allows us to use it in ways that we haven't used it in the past. And that's where the role of the customer comes in, because the role of the customer can help guide many of those incremental decisions about how to invest in the existing infrastructure to get more of it, to get more from it, so that we can increase the productivity. So when you see customer-led infrastructure, I'm really referring to what I call the quality of capital intermediation. I'm an economist, so I'll peel that back for the engineers and so forth, and that is the quality of the infrastructure allocation decision and how we can get more productivity and more performance out of the existing infrastructure. And of course, Australia is growing fast. We're the only country that occupies an entire continent, and there is mega projects to be done. I completely accept that. But it's not the only game that we should be pursuing. And the call back to customer-led infrastructure is to remind us that we have actually had a very successful period of privatised infrastructure where fiduciary boards, light-handed regulation, interacting with the customer, where governments actually say, let's get out of the way and allow owners and operators to interact with their customers, results in very astute capital allocation. And that is the point of my remarks to you today. So you can leave if you want because you've heard it. So I come from the John Grill, now the John Grill Institute. We've just been promoted, and that comes with some benefits and costs, just like all infrastructure. And we think a lot about projects. And while this is a slight deviation from customer-led projects, I think it's pertinent to the conversation today. And this is where I hail from. We're all very proud of two iconic pieces of infrastructure that appear in this picture. But of course, when this picture, if you sort of scratch below it, you start to see things that perhaps aren't so marvellous. And that is that there was about a 50 to 55 year period between the completion of the asset at the back of the photo compared to the one at the front of the photo. And J.J. Bradfield was a very confident engineer. In fact, he was a budding economist. And to the best of my records, J.J. Bradfield initiated the first cost-benefit analysis in Australia for the construction of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and also identified the importance of land value capture as well. But that's a whole other story. My point to you today is that the quality of both governance and performance as a project of the Sydney Harbour Bridge, and to the best of my ability, I think it came in around 12% over budget, maybe 17%. That's my estimate. Compared to somebody that I know is dear to many of your hearts, is Ben Fleeberg, who I know very well, who very rhetorically put it that the Sydney Opera House is the worst infrastructure project in the world. And he cited a spectacular number of 1,200% over budget. And when we look at those two assets and the great precinct that makes that not only Sydney, but is in many ways definitional to us, to the way people perceive Australia, we go, who cares? 1,200%. But look at it; it's gorgeous, it's wonderful. And part of the challenge to us is that infrastructure and time are good buddies because it's very forgiving. Over time, and particularly countries like this where they're growing fast and so forth, we can do very well with our infrastructure. But that is not a license to any one of you to be reckless and to be profligate in your expenses. And I think as professionals that we all have a responsibility to say, yeah, it may heal itself in the long term, that all our infrastructure generally becomes valuable, but in terms of the opportunity cost of those of choosing poorly and spending unwisely comes at a very high cost, and that's part of the discussion today that we need. And I do agree with the earlier comments about leadership. Leadership, yes, and consensus, hopefully, but to be frank, it's not always a necessary criteria. And that was certainly the case with the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Consensus was not an essential criteria, although it did have 107 years of planning. Some of you might be surprised by that, including two royal commissions. Two royal commissions as well. It's fascinating reading, but we won't go there, otherwise I'll get distracted. So we're all fascinated and, if not intoxicated, drunk even, that infrastructure is good for our country. So therefore, more infrastructure spending must be better. And we have prestigious organisations, be it the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the G20, the OECD, or even our Reserve Bank, says that we should invest in infrastructure. We invest in infrastructure to drive up productivity, growth and jobs. But there's an important proviso to these calls to spend more, to get on with it, to stimulate the economy. And that is, as Marion quite rightly pointed out, that governments must select the right projects. That is true, but also they find this very, very difficult to do. And as Garry Banks, the former chairman of the Productivity Commission, says, that when we make poor infrastructure decisions, well then there is a very high opportunity cost to both productivity and to economic growth. And one of the areas that has resonated, which has pleased me with this conversation that I've heard so far, is that there is an enormous scope for improvement, and that scope for improvement is maybe even more than what you think. There's not a lot of studies around that tell us what are the benefits of infrastructure and infrastructure spending, and what is the impact on economic activity. But the gentleman by the name of Straub in 2008 did a World Bank study, and it was a serious academic study, ladies and gentlemen. It looked at over 70 econometric models and across both the developing and the developed world, and it came up with some very startling numbers that many of us, I think, are ready to sweep under the carpet and say, that can't be right. And that is that 30% of our infrastructure spending has no impact on economic output. No impact on economic output in the developed world. And when it comes to the developing world, it actually escalates to 55%. So you can say, and I used to be an econometrician, you can sort of weave your way through and say, well, that can't be right. Okay, well then divide it by 2. Okay? Divided by 2 is, then does that make it all right? And my point is that a part of this issue is that we have a great deal of infrastructure that really hasn't, in the world that hasn't been pulling its weight. And the numbers are actually higher if you include negative impact on economic activity. So you might note that I said no impact. That's the optimistic side. But when it has a negative impact by holding down productivity growth because of very poor allocation decisions. So the overriding theme of my my proposition to you today is that there is actually a role for customers and that there's actually a role for markets, even amongst these monopolists that deliver so much of our infrastructure. And that the clarion call to you is, and my research has confirmed this time and time again, is what customers care about is not the physical infrastructure, but the services that are delivered to them by that infrastructure. But yet so much of our effort goes into the physicality of the infrastructure rather than the services that it will deliver. And that represents a fundamental problem, a problem that is really not being fronted up to by anybody in the sector in any serious way. And one of the areas that I think is probably of most offence to this proposition is in fact the transportation sector. The transportation sector is asset mad, building mad, and not particularly interested in the quality of the services over the life of the asset. Not interested in the quality of the services over the life of the asset. And that's really a challenge that I'm putting out to each and every one of you as to how do we change that, because the customers, the community, the economy relies on that enterprise and that dynamism that sits there in terms of ensuring that our infrastructure is relevant. So Australia doesn't have a spending problem. We sit in the top 5 nations of the world as a percentage of GDP on what we spend on infrastructure. We're good spenders. And it's not a passing fad. We've been doing it for a long time. And as you would expect, anyone that flies over this country knows how much we have to spend in order to make it work. It's an enormous undertaking. But by the same token, we have a translation problem. We don't have a money problem. We have a translation problem of putting money into infrastructure and getting the benefits out of that infrastructure. And over the last decade, the numbers are just simply staggering, that we've spent over $500 billion on infrastructure. That's double the size of the previous decade, and it's not coming back. It's only getting bigger, as Marion quite rightly pointed out, with the ambitions of our politicians towards infrastructure. But yet the livability of our cities, congestion levels, emission levels, high costs, availability of access and so forth really remain at very challenging levels. But yet we should be seeing some material benefit. And part of that is that we still continue to be asset mad rather than service focused when it comes to infrastructure. And this particular chart looks at innovation in the infrastructure sector compared to other areas of the Australian economy. And if you look at the areas that approximate to infrastructure, which is the utility sector, say the construction sector, and also transport and logistics, infrastructure is a middle to low performing player when it comes to innovation. And one of the reasons I would put that to you is that the infrastructure sector has been micromanaged to an inch of its life, that there is a huge amount of innovation and genius that exists within the infrastructure sector, and in particular with the private organisations that look at our infrastructure and know that there are better solutions, and they're not being able to exercise those solutions because of government supervision, if you like, and very tight contractual terms and conditions that enable that. And it disappoints me greatly. I have worked in the sector, both in the private sector, in the government sector, over 2 decades, and it disappoints me greatly that I know the genius, I know the quality of the people in the infrastructure sector, and yet we sit towards the bottom end of the country when it comes to innovation. And we need to sort of shift that along and make significant improvements. in that area. And almost to be permissionless in our innovation, that is, that we have to impose it on governments because they don't seem to understand that it's beneficial to them. And that sort of takes me to the next chapter of this proposition that I'm putting to you. And I was fascinated by one of the first speakers about risk and the way it's managed. And I was listening to the syntax of risk, and the syntax of risk is very much about control, very much about management. So much control, so much management, so much scrutiny, but yet it's performing so poorly in terms of costs and in terms of translation of benefits. And part of the problem, I think, part of the cultural problem that we have in the sector is that we don't really see risk for what it is. It's not bureaucratic processes of management and control. It's about how does risk drive innovation? How does risk create innovation and value to the benefit of both the customers and also to the benefit of the nation through productivity. And the proposition of this, and I don't expect you to absorb this, we go out of our way, whether it's with governments or even institutional investors, to say, how do we make infrastructure low risk? There are many investors out there that say they actually want it to be riskless. And when that happens, what you're really saying is that you're looking at infrastructure that is dead, that the way you build it is the way it will be. It's not dynamic, it's not enterprising, it's not adaptive, it's not sensitive to the community and the economy that it serves. And there is a real fundamental challenge here as to how do we make uncertainty and how do we make risk a driver of innovation and value creation. And I've been involved in the public-private partnership area for a long time, and there are areas where it has worked well, but by the same token, the longer those concessions are, the more sensitive they need to be to the opportunity that sits around those concessions in year 10, year 20, year 30, because they're very different opportunities, very different economies, and there's upsides and downsides. But quite often those concessions make the concessionaire dull, lazy, inactive towards these changes. And we need to be injecting greater enterprise and greater dynamism so that they can show their ingenuity in terms of coming up with new products and services that allow our infrastructure to be dynamic and enterprising and relevant. An example of this in practice. So much of our discussion in infrastructure is about cost leadership. Much of the discussion today has been about cost and how to manage costs and the quality of the data to do that. And Ben Flyberg and others have been all very active in this space. But the problem over the long term when we're cost focused, whether it's through our regulatory or contractual approaches, is that the value creation curve that sits around a cost mentality is logarithmic. So for that additional effort of management and of time that you put into managing your costs, in order to get that next element of cost savings, you have to try even harder and harder and harder. So it's a diminishing return. And that diminishing return is not what will serve infrastructure well. And that we've overdone the cost control and the cost leadership of infrastructure. And what I would suggest is that we actually need a more customer-centric one. And what I mean by customer-centric isn't some glib sort of, let's make our customers happy. What we're really saying is that you need a price for quality spectrum applied, and that there is the ability to have what we call in the infrastructure sort of investment space, price discovery. And that is, what is the willingness to pay for the next increment of infrastructure capacity, if you like. And these are very, very powerful concepts that are used in every other part of our economy. Price discovery mechanisms. But yet, when it comes to infrastructure, we appoint a committee, so-called independent, and we expect them to make these decisions. We need to sort of get a more dynamic price for quality spectrum happening, where there is certainly social inclusion, where there is a minimum price for quality so that all can get access to the benefits of infrastructure, but then we need to sort of look at how do you build different price for quality spectrums into the proposition. This stuff is published on my website. There are books that I've written about it. If you're inclined to sort of go further on the John Gruhl website. So what can be done about creating more customer benefit with less dollars? Well, there's lots of things. Firstly, we have to accept one very basic proposition. That is, by simply adding to the stock of infrastructure, the capital stock of infrastructure will not deliver you better national performance. In fact, I would argue that it may actually go the other direction. And when the Reserve Bank Governor is sort of suggesting that we spend more on infrastructure, that may be true. That may be true, but it comes with a lot of caveats that I'd like to see him express in the same way that he expresses that when talking about the exchange rate or talking about domestic interest rates, that these statements are highly nuanced. But what we're not hearing from the Governor is highly nuanced statements around infrastructure. All we're hearing is, let it rip. He can do better. He can do better on this, because what he says matters, and we need to sort of look at that. And as part of that, refocusing not on assets but rather on service outcomes, what I'm suggesting is that you start to create a market structure. You start to create a market structure where you can actually start to reward more innovation and also for better service outcomes. You have a greater role in problem solving as to how might you resolve the infrastructure need, not with a new building or a new structure, but with doing something to the existing infrastructure, and to extract more value from those existing assets. So I mentioned to you before that in the work that I've written and so forth, that I think that there is merit. And this is not unqualified merit, it is qualified in the sense that the privatisation experiences in this country we need to improve on it continuously. But when it comes to the Australian airports, I think that the data, which is now 23, 24 years in total, that operational efficiency, profitability, scaled investments, big and small investments, traffic diversity, resilience of our airports have all performed very, very well. And that while there's more work to be done, I think that this sector in many ways exemplifies the characteristics that I'm talking about of having better intermediated capital. And I'd like to see more of that. But unfortunately, the sector, the infrastructure lobby, everyone else, is just not talking about it. You know, we had the 20th anniversary of airport privatisations. We have delegations after delegations come and see what Australia did on airport privatisations because they want to mimic it, but it's become very unfashionable to even acknowledge it and what it did. And I can assure you, any of you that are old enough to remember what government supervision of our airports looked like, that if you even wanted to put a fire extinguisher in a different place, it took 12 months and a forest of paper to get the permission from the bureaucratic agency in Canberra. So in summary, the institutional reform that I'd like to suggest as part of this wonderful conversation is really focuses on accountability and transparency to customers and community. And to do that, we need to set more focus on what are customer-focused network objectives. What's the service delivery? That when we announce a road, when we announce a metro system, what are those service delivery outcomes that we're seeking to achieve? And what do they look like in year 1? And what do they look like in year 20? And how will that evolve over time? And how are we going to know if we've achieved that? None of this is even sort of deliberated upon in the public domain. I think that we also need to have an infrastructure asset register. We need to understand and put our infrastructure assets and disclose them on a balance sheet. And when it's on a balance sheet, we then start to apply the normal accounting rules as to what is the value of an asset and how that asset needs to be maintained, dissolved, got rid of, or something else. We also should look at the role of corporatising the road network and setting a rate of return. And this is not radical stuff. Highways England is well on the way to doing this. And the reason that it's important is that we're saying, by setting a rate of return, you're saying, well, what can we do to extract the value of the existing infrastructure more efficiently before we build another road? That's all part of the performance of having a balance sheet and a rate of return regime. And the other area is to utilise the private sector to ensure that risk is shared properly, that there's a more nuanced risk allocation, there's upside and downside. We reward over performance, where customers say that performance is good, and we emphasise that economic life cycle. So when we talk about customers, we're not really saying to you that customers know everything. They certainly don't. But there is great benefit when owners and operators of infrastructure interact and have an intelligent dialogue two ways about what is the future infrastructure that we need. And that is why the domain of infrastructure is sometimes with governments, sometimes with independent agencies, but always with the customer. And it's from that point that I say to you, as I reflect on this wonderful conversation from T.S. Eliot's Hollow Men, between the idea of infrastructure and the reality of infrastructure falls the shadow. Thank you.